The train screeched to a halt under a Texas sun that burned like judgment. Dust swirled through the slats of the boxcars, catching the light in dull golden shafts. Inside, dozens of German women, some nurses, some clerks, a few still in tattered auxiliary uniforms, pressed against the wooden walls. Their faces were hollow from the long crossing. Germany to Le Havre, then across the Atlantic, then this endless continent that seemed to stretch forever. The guards called out, not harshly, but firmly, and the women flinched at every sound. The heavy doors slid open, and the first blast of dry American air hit them, warm, clean, scented faintly of pine. They blinked, half expecting to see rows of guns or snarling dogs. Instead, there were men in pressed khaki shirts, their sleeves rolled up, their voices calm. One of them even lifted a hand to shade his eyes and said something almost gentle. "Welcome to Camp Hearn, ladies." The women froze. "Welcome?" The word passed from one to another in whispers. Some laughed under their breath, a sharp, nervous sound, thinking it must be a trick. They stepped down one by one, their boots crunching on gravel. Around them stretched neat fences of clean wire, guard towers painted fresh, and beyond that, rows of long wooden barracks with whitewashed trim. Everything was tidy. Not the broken landscape of war they had come to expect. No rubble, no shouting. Only the drone of cicadas and the faint creak of an American flag in the wind. Helga, who had once been a schoolteacher in Bremen, squinted toward the horizon. She thought she saw a church steeple beyond the trees. For a moment, she forgot she was a prisoner. Then the realization returned like a slap. America. The enemy. The land, she had been told, was filled with decadence, chaos, and cruelty. When they were marched through the gate, they noticed something that unsettled them even more. The guards didn't sneer. Some even smiled faintly, nodding as if in polite greeting. The women kept their eyes down, remembering what the propaganda posters had warned, that Americans would humiliate them, make them labor in chains, strip them of dignity. But here, no one shouted. No one struck them. Instead, a medical officer with wire-rimmed glasses approached and, through an interpreter, instructed them to line up for processing. "Names, occupations, health check," he said, his tone neutral. "Then you'll receive clothing, quarters, and your first meal." It sounded impossible. First meal. Their last real meal in Germany had been weeks ago. Watery soup and black bread. Some women began to cry quietly, not from hunger, but from confusion. Inside the barracks, the air smelled of pine boards and disinfectant. Beds, real beds, stood in rows, each with a thin mattress and folded blanket. On one wall, a small sign read, "Keep cleanliness, it means health." The words were painted in careful block letters, and below them hung a metal rack of towels. In that moment, something subtle broke inside them. Not fear, but certainty. For years they had been told the Americans were savages. Now, in this quiet, ordered space, their hatred began to tremble. Marta, the youngest of them, only 19, whispered to her companion, "It's too clean. They are preparing something." Her voice shook. "It's not real." Yet the next morning, before sunrise, the guards woke them softly and led them to a low building marked bathhouse. The air was cool, the ground damp with dew. Steam rose faintly from vents along the roof. The women entered hesitantly, expecting interrogation or perhaps disinfection like they had endured back in Europe. Harsh chemicals, shouting officers, humiliation. Instead, the scent that met them was lavender. Inside, there were rows of metal spigots, all pouring real, hot water. On the benches lay stacks of towels, clean and dry. And on the shelves, dozens of small brown bars wrapped in paper that read, U.S. Army Soap, Standard Issue. The women stared. No one moved. The American attendant, a young corporal from Iowa, gestured awkwardly, his face red. "You can wash," he said. "Hot water's free. Towels after." Then he stepped aside, looking anywhere but at them. At first, no one dared. Then Helga stepped forward, her hands trembling. She turned the valve, and a gush of hot water burst forth. She gasped, jerking her hands back, then tried again. The heat soaked through her skin, into her bones, washing away the smell of travel, fear, and defeat. Tears sprang to her eyes without warning. One by one, the others followed. The room filled with the sound of water striking metal, the faint sighs of disbelief. The steam blurred the edges of everything, the walls, the faces, the memory of war. Outside, a guard leaned against the wall, hearing the laughter begin inside, soft at first, then rising, like something fragile coming back to life. He lit a cigarette and looked toward the horizon. He had seen the men's camps, thousands of tough Wehrmacht soldiers hardened by the front. But these were women, daughters, mothers, and for a moment, he felt something shift inside him too. Inside, Marta held the small bar of soap to her nose. It smelled faintly of vanilla. She whispered, almost to herself, "How can they afford this? During war?" No one answered. The question hung in the steam like prayer. For a brief instant, the women forgot they were prisoners. The war, the slogans, the lies, all seemed impossibly far away. There was only the sound of falling water, the rhythm of breath, the warmth on skin. They did not yet know that this small act, a shower, a bar of soap, would begin to undo years of hatred. But in that hour, something had already begun. The slow, quiet breaking of walls that had been built not of stone, but of belief. The water had stopped, but something remained. Not just the warmth on their skin or the clean scent that clung to their fingers. Something deeper. The silence afterward was not hollow. It was filled with questions. Marta clutched her towel as though it were made of gold. Helga sat on the edge of the bench for a long time, her wet hair dripping down the curve of her back. Neither woman said a word as they dressed in the plain, neatly folded garments laid out for them. Cotton shirts, canvas trousers, underclothes, American-made, yes, but clean, whole, and offered. A guard held open the door as they exited. He didn't leer, he didn't laugh. He simply nodded once and stepped aside. That evening, the women were assigned to Barracks C6, 10 women to a room, each with a narrow bed and a wooden footlocker. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a quiet, steady light. Along one wall, someone had pinned a small print of a rural American landscape. Fields stretching beneath a wide sky, a barn in the distance. "No barbed wire in the painting," whispered Ingrid, the seamstress from Stuttgart, as she unpacked her only possession, a photograph of her mother, worn at the edges. That night, few of them slept. The stillness was too strange, too unfamiliar. There was no whistle of bombs, no distant thunder of artillery. Only cicadas and the low hum of fans from the mess hall across the yard. Helga stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine the rest of America beyond the fences. Did it all look like this? Could it really be so normal? So peaceful? While cities across Europe still burned? The next morning, they were issued paper ration cards and small booklets labeled Rules for POW Conduct. The rules were typed in both English and German. No weapons, No escape attempts, no resistance, but also access to showers every 48 hours. Mail allowed to family. No physical punishment. Education courses available on request. Education. One woman laughed out loud. Will they teach us how to hate ourselves? But no one replied. The words on the page didn't match anything they'd been told about Americans. After breakfast, oatmeal, eggs, white bread still warm, the camp commander addressed them briefly through an interpreter. He was a short man, sunburnt and calm, his uniform creased like an office clerk's. You are prisoners of war, yes, he said plainly. But you are also women, human beings, and guests under our protection. You will be treated with respect as long as you respect the rules. That is all. He stepped down, handed his cap to a soldier, and walked away. No speech, no gloating, just order. That day, the women were taken in groups across the campgrounds. A Red Cross official, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard, explained the layout. She spoke in German. Laundry building, recreation hall, infirmary, church. Church? Someone asked. Yes, shared by all denominations. Services held in English and German. Another pause, another crack in the wall. As they passed the recreation hall, they could hear music playing inside. A gramophone record, faint but clear. A woman's voice, jazz, American. The tune swung lightly, wistful as if from another planet. It was the first time many of them had heard music in months. Ingrid murmured, "If this is captivity, what does freedom mean?" At noon, the heat deepened. Shadows curled beneath the barracks, and the women lined up for a midday break in the shade. A young American soldier, his name stitched across his uniform read Coleman, passed by pushing a cart. He stopped, looked at them, and after a moment, reached into the tray and held out a handful of apples, real apples. Round, unblemished, red as postcards. No one moved. "Take one," he said in halting German. "Good, sweet." One woman stepped forward, Johanna, who had lost 2 brothers in Russia, and took the fruit. She held it as if unsure it wouldn't vanish. She didn't bite it right away. She smelled it, then passed it between her hands, marveling at the smooth skin. "You should eat it," Coleman smiled. "We have more." The words echoed louder than intended. We have more. In Germany, such a statement would have sounded obscene. There was never more. There was barely enough to survive. Bombed-out markets, ration lines, powdered eggs, sawdust bread. Those had been her reality. But here, in a prisoner of war camp of all places, someone offered more. That night, Johanna didn't sleep either. She sat beneath the small reading light in her barrack and stared at the apple's core, clean down to the seed. "Do you think they're trying to trick us?" Marta asked from across the room. "If it is a trick," Johanna said quietly, "it's a beautiful one." The women began to speak in low voices, not about escape or punishment, but about the absurdity of it all. That America, this enemy nation, could offer them soap, water, even kindness. They recalled the words of their training. The Americans are mongrels. They are greedy, corrupt, incapable of honor. But those words began to sound hollow now, crumbling under the weight of simple actions. No ideology could explain warm bread, soft towels, or clean hands. And still, each day, the guards opened the gates to the shower building again. The same steam, the same gentle scent of vanilla soap greeted them. They no longer rushed to leave. Some lingered. A few began to sing softly in the mist. They began to wonder, with growing discomfort, what else might have been lies. The first week passed like a long dream, half believed, half feared. The women still woke each morning, expecting the illusion to dissolve. Surely there must come a reckoning, some kind of punishment. Yet each day began the same way. The clang of the breakfast bell, the faint aroma of coffee, and the slow hum of life inside the camp. On the 7th morning, a guard appeared at their barracks door and said simply, "Bathhouse, Group 4. His tone was formal, not unkind. They followed in silence, their boots crunching on the gravel. The sun hung low, washing the camp in a pale, amber light. Dew still clung to the grass, and the sound of flagpoles tapping in the wind filled the empty air. As they neared the bath building, Marta whispered, "They must be preparing another inspection." But inside, nothing had changed. The same steam, the same scent of soap, the same gentle order. The corporal on duty that day was different, younger than the last. His uniform looked slightly too big, his cap tilted awkwardly. When the women entered, he cleared his throat and looked away, pretending to read a clipboard. 10 minutes each, he said, his accent thick with the Midwest. Clean towels on the bench, soap on the shelf. That word again, soap. It had become a symbol, almost holy. Helga reached for one of the small brown bars. Her hands shook. She had seen soap once before, months earlier, but it had been gray, coarse, and made from sawdust and animal fat. This one gleamed faintly in the light, smooth and pale, with faint ridges from its mold. She turned it over in her hand and whispered, "How can they make so many?" No one answered. The question seemed too large. Steam filled the air as the pipes began to hiss. The first drops fell with a hiss that sounded almost like rain. When the warm water touched their skin, the women gasped again. But this time, not in fear. The sensation was overwhelming. Helga closed her eyes. The warmth spread across her shoulders, her back, her scalp. She felt dirt and salt dissolve from her hair, running down the drain in small rivers of brown. For the first time in months, she could smell herself as human again. Around her, voices began to rise. Not words, just soft laughter. The sound startled the corporal outside. He smiled to himself and lit a cigarette. Inside, Marta leaned against the wall, her hair plastered to her face. "It's like home," she whispered. Before, she didn't finish. The others knew what she meant. Before the sirens, before the firestorms, before everything they'd been told about enemies and monsters. When they stepped out, wrapped in coarse white towels, the morning light struck them in a way they had never felt before. Not as prisoners, but as living, clean beings. Their skin glowed faintly. Some laughed. Some wept quietly. Helga looked down at the ground, at the small puddles forming by the drain, and murmured, "All that dirt, all that fear, gone." Behind them, a Red Cross worker, Miss Caroline Baker, was checking supplies. She watched the women emerge, her face unreadable. Later, she would write in her diary, "They arrived hollow-eyed, expecting cruelty. But when they saw the water, it was as if I witnessed a whole nation breathe again." In the mess hall that afternoon, the change was visible. The women sat straighter. Their voices were quieter, but no longer bitter. Even the guards seemed to sense the shift. At one table, Ingrid traced circles on the wooden surface with her fingertip and said softly, "Do you think they have this at home?" "Their families." Helga nodded. "Maybe everyone does." The thought struck her. Everyone. Not just officers or the powerful. Even farmers, mechanics, school teachers. The idea of a country where the poor could bathe daily seemed absurd, almost offensive. Back in Germany, soap had been rationed since 1941. Hot water was a luxury reserved for hospitals or officers' homes. Civilians washed in cold basins or used vinegar. But here, in a camp for enemies, there was abundance, not excess, but enough for all. That night, Marta wrote a letter. She wasn't sure it would ever reach home, but the act of writing gave her peace. Dearest Mother, we are prisoners, yes, but not suffering. I don't understand this country. They give us soap, towels, warm food. It feels like kindness, but it also feels impossible. Do they live like this always? Even during war? If they do, then everything we were told was wrong. And if it's wrong, what else have we not seen? She folded the letter and slipped it beneath her pillow. Later, when the lights went out, the air inside the barracks carried a faint scent of the soap. Clean, almost sweet. It clung to their skin, their clothes, even their dreams. Somewhere beyond the wire, the camp loudspeaker played a record. Slow, crackling, a love song in English they couldn't fully understand. But they recognized its tone. Gentleness. It stirred something unnameable in them. Helga lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, turning slowly above. The rhythm reminded her of the trains that had carried them across the continent. But unlike those trains, this one did not lead toward darkness. It led toward an idea she barely dared to imagine. That their captors might not be enemies at all. She turned her face toward the faint moonlight slipping through the window slats and whispered, "If this is what they call civilization, then what were we?" No one answered. Only the soft hum of the fan, the far-off rustle of trees, and the faint, lingering scent of soap filled the silence. The smell of something ending, and something else just beginning. The scent lingered. It clung to their hair, to their fingernails, to the fabric of their thin uniforms. It floated through the barracks like a ghost, clean, warm, impossible. Some of the women caught themselves lifting their hands to their faces throughout the day, inhaling that faint sweetness as if trying to prove it was still real. By now, the daily rhythm had taken hold. Morning roll call, breakfast, chores, showers, classes for English or sewing, evening reflection. For women who had lived through years of chaos, the very predictability of it felt disorienting. There were rules, yes, but they were human rules. Measured, fair, and still, the question whispered through the camp like wind through reeds. How can they afford this? That morning, Helga stood by the laundry line, watching the towels dry in the sunlight. Rows of white rectangles rippled gently in the breeze, like flags of surrender. She thought of Bremen, the gray river, the soot, the ruins of her old school where chalk dust had once floated in calm morning air. There, soap had been a rumor. Even officers' families had rationed it. The rich had traded jewelry for a single bar. Here, it was issued freely, as casually as water. Marta joined her, holding her freshly washed uniform. "Do you ever think this is all for show?" she asked. "For whose benefit?" Helga replied. "There's no camera here, no propaganda office, just us." Marta looked toward the guard tower. "Maybe that's the point, to make us believe something." Helga folded her arms. "Maybe to make us unbelieve something." That word hung between them, unbelieve. It was not rebellion, it was awakening. Later, during lunch, they sat beside the window in the mess hall. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, bitter, dark, miraculous. It had been years since any of them had tasted real coffee. Johanna closed her eyes after her first sip and whispered, "It's not the taste. It's the permission to taste." A few tables away, an American sergeant laughed at something a cook said, the sound deep and effortless. None of the women flinched. They were learning that laughter did not always signal cruelty. That afternoon, a Red Cross nurse visited to inspect the camp hygiene. Her name was Miss Baker, the same woman who had written in her diary about their first shower. She carried a clipboard and a kind of quiet authority that needed no weapons. When she entered Barracks C6, she greeted them in halting German. "You keep things clean. Very good. Very good." Helga nodded politely, unsure what to say. Miss Baker smiled faintly and pointed to the towel rack. "You know, in my country, we say soap is civilization. You can judge a nation by whether its poor can bathe." Helga stared at her, the words echoing like thunder. Soap is civilization. After Miss Baker left, the women sat in silence. That phrase became the evening's quiet refrain. Ingrid murmured it while mending a shirt. Marta repeated it softly before lights out. Soap, this thing they had once seen as trivial, was now a symbol of something vast, invisible, moral. It was more than cleanliness. It was dignity. The next day, Helga found herself in the camp library, a small wooden building stocked with donated books, magazines, and old newspapers. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust. On a table near the door lay a pile of American magazines: Life, Ladies' Home Journal, Saturday Evening Post. She flipped one open and froze. There was a photograph of a smiling family beside a white sink, the caption reading, "Every home deserves hot water. Every child deserves cleanliness." It was propaganda of a different kind. Not the triumph of armies, but the triumph of ordinary life. The smiling mother, the chubby child holding a bar of soap, the clean kitchen. They were not symbols of luxury. They were symbols of equality. Helga turned the page and whispered, almost angrily, "We were told they were savages." A nearby guard overheard and looked up, puzzled. "What's that, ma'am?" She shook her head. Nothing. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fan creaked above. The moonlight pooled across the floorboards, and the faint smell of soap still lingered in the air. She realized it wasn't just a scent anymore. It had become a reminder, a key unlocking a world that functioned not through power, but through plenty. She thought of her students back in Bremen, their thin faces, their worn shoes. She had taught them about purity, discipline, loyalty to the fatherland. But she had never taught them about warmth, never about kindness. She pressed her hands to her face and began to cry. Not loudly, but like someone finally remembering what gentleness felt like. The next morning, as the women queued again for their showers, Helga looked at the steam rising through the roof vents and thought of Miss Baker's words. Soap is civilization. Inside, the same corporal was on duty. He smiled shyly as the women entered. "Hot water ready," he said. "Plenty today." Plenty. Such an American word. Casual, generous, careless even. To them, it sounded like a hymn. Marta stepped beneath the stream first. The water ran down her arms, across her collarbones, down her back, and for the first time, she didn't think of herself as a prisoner. She thought of her mother, washing her as a child in a tin basin, humming softly to keep the darkness away. Now, that same sound returned. A low hum, a melody. Not from one woman, but from many. Soon the whole bathhouse echoed with quiet humming, voices blending with the sound of falling water. The corporal outside stopped writing his report. He listened. It wasn't a song he recognized, but he could tell. It wasn't about sorrow. It was about survival. Inside, Marta whispered, "This is what peace must smell like." And for a moment, brief, fragile, infinite, it was true. But truth, for these women, had been a shifting thing. For years, it had worn a uniform. It had spoken with banners and microphones. It had marched in the cold and barked commands from podiums. Truth had been delivered in ration lines, air raid sirens, and the trembling whispers of fear in the night. Now, in the warmth of water and the softness of a towel, Another truth was emerging, quiet, unannounced, but impossible to ignore. And it frightened them, not because it was cruel, but because it was kind. Johanna sat alone at a wooden bench behind the infirmary, peeling an orange a guard had quietly handed her after morning roll call. The citrus smell clung to her fingers, vivid, alive, and made her eyes sting. There had been no oranges in Leipzig for over 2 years. Not for civilians, not even in the black market. She stared at the fruit in her hands and whispered, "They told us Americans were beasts, gluttons, decadent pigs who had no culture." She took a bite. "But this tastes like mercy." Behind her, Ingrid approached with a stack of laundry in a canvas bag. "They also told us the British starved their prisoners and the Americans shot surrendering men in the back." She sat down slowly. "They said the Allies wanted to erase us, that their goal was to destroy German womanhood itself." Johanna nodded. "And now we are sitting in sunlight with soap and oranges." Neither of them laughed. It wasn't funny. That afternoon, a group of women were assigned to the Camp Education Center, not to study, but to clean. The Americans gave them buckets, brushes, and white gloves. Inside the small wooden building were shelves of books in both English and German. One of the shelves was labeled, "Understanding Democracy." Another, "World Cultures." A third, "German Literature before 1933. Marta ran her fingers along the spine of one book, a faded volume of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister. She pulled it free. The paper smelled old and familiar. She opened the front cover and found an inscription in soft pencil. "Donated by the West Liberty High School Library, Iowa." Below it, in neat cursive, "For the women who will remember what beauty feels like." She stood still for a long time. Outside, Helga swept the steps while a young American sergeant leaned against a post, smoking. "Did you go to school?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I taught school," she said quietly. "Latin, history." He blinked. "Huh. My mom was a teacher." He paused, then added, "Before the Depression, then she made dresses for soldiers' wives." He looked at her and smiled, not unkindly. "Funny world." Helga said nothing. But that night, she wrote her first letter in weeks. "Father, they do not treat us like animals. That alone is enough to undo much of what I believed. I don't know what this country is, but I am beginning to suspect that its power lies not in its army, but in its decency. I am not saying they are saints. I am saying they are not what we were told. And maybe we aren't either." That letter would never reach him. She knew that. Still, writing it helped. A few days later, the camp allowed the women to view a documentary. It was held in the recreation hall, a converted mess space with rows of chairs, a reel-to-reel projector, and a canvas screen. The guards did not tell them what the film was. They only said, "You should see it." The lights dimmed, the projector clattered. The film was American, black and white. But it was not propaganda in the old style, no triumphant marches or patriotic slogans. It showed the liberation of camps. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. It showed emaciated bodies stacked like firewood, children with sunken eyes, women with shaved heads and arms like twigs, American medics sobbing, British soldiers burning piles of lice-infested rags. The room went silent. Even the guards did not move. Ingrid covered her mouth. Marta turned away. Helga sat rigid, her jaw clenched, her hands balled into fists. None of them had ever seen such images. None had imagined the scale, the cruelty, not truly. They had heard whispers, of course. They had dismissed them as Allied lies. But here it was, on screen, flickering, undeniable. When the lights came up, no one spoke for a long time. Then Johanna stood. Her voice cracked as she said, "Why show us this?" The American interpreter, a quiet man with a southern accent, answered, "Because it happened, and because it's easier to rebuild something when you know what was destroyed." Later that night in the barracks, the women sat in silence. Soap, water, towels, music, and now this, Marta whispered. "I thought they were trying to make us weak with comfort. But maybe they are trying to make us strong with truth." Helga looked down at her hands, still smelling faintly of lavender, and said, "They have given us something more dangerous than punishment." Ingrid tilted her head. "What?" Helga exhaled. "A mirror." Outside, the moon hung low over the Texas hills, pale and still. In the darkness, the camp no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a place where the mind might begin again. And from the quiet corners of Camp Hearn, from beneath the shadows of water towers and the wire fences that once symbolized defeat, small signs of renewal began to bloom. Not loudly, not quickly, but unmistakably. It began with laughter. Real laughter. Not the sharp, ironic kind meant to shield pain, but laughter that came from surprise, from warmth. One afternoon, while helping a guard fix a broken clothesline near the women's barracks, Marta slipped on a patch of damp earth and landed flat on her back, splashing muddy water in every direction. The American corporal froze, horrified. But before he could speak, Marta burst out laughing. For a moment, she couldn't stop. The other women, Johanna, Ingrid, even stern Helga, stood around her, caught between shock and amusement. Then, slowly, the laughter spread. It was the first time since captivity began that they had sounded like girls again. The corporal offered his hand sheepishly. Marta took it. She said, "In Germany, you would be court-martialed for letting a woman fall." He smirked, brushing dirt from her shoulder. "In Texas, we just call it a good story." That night, over supper, the story made its way around the camp like a spark. Even the guards chuckled, and from that moment forward, the barrier between captor and captive softened, if only slightly. The next morning, Helga received a package from the Red Cross, a reply to a letter she'd written weeks before. Inside were 2 small photographs from home, one of her mother beside a half-destroyed garden wall, the other of her younger brother, Hans, in his school uniform, standing beside a sign that read, "Victory will be ours." Helga stared at the photos for a long time. The handwriting on the back was faint, trembling, her mother's script. "We are alive. There is no food, but we are alive." She folded the note carefully and held it to her chest. For the rest of that day, she was silent, but not hardened. Instead, she watched the world around her with new eyes. At the outdoor laundry station, she saw Johanna teaching a young American nurse a German lullaby, one her own mother used to sing. The nurse laughed at the strange sounds, trying to imitate them. She failed miserably, and they both laughed. Later, by the library, Marta was reading an English book titled Little Women Out Loud to a group of women gathered in a circle. Most didn't understand the words fully, but they listened to her tone. Calm, maternal, full of story. And at sundown, while walking back from the bathhouse, Ingrid pointed to the western horizon, where the sun dipped behind the trees. "The sky is exactly the same as back home," she said. "Even the war couldn't change that." That evening, the camp interpreter, a Nisei American named Kenji Nakamura, whose family had been interned in California during the war, sat on a stool near the women's mess hall. He had been raised in San Francisco, fluent in both German and Japanese. Helga asked him gently, "Why are you here? Helping us?" Kenji paused. Then he said, "My parents are behind barbed wire too. Not because they fought, but because they looked like someone else. I thought if I helped build bridges, maybe someone would help them someday. No one spoke. That night, in the barracks, a soft voice began humming. It was Johanna again, the same lullaby from earlier. This time, others joined in. Not in unison, not perfectly, but enough to fill the room with the echo of something human. A guard walking past paused at the sound. He didn't knock. He just stood still, listening. Inside, Marta whispered, "Do you remember when music belonged to us?" "Yes," said Helga. "Now it belongs to everyone." The following week, the women were allowed to participate in a camp letter writing session. Tables were set up under the shade of a tree grove behind the Red Cross building. The U.S. Army provided pencils, envelopes, and simple paper. As the women wrote, slowly, thoughtfully, the warm wind lifted the corners of their pages, fluttering them like fragile wings. Marta wrote, "Dear Papa, I have learned how to laugh again. I didn't expect it, but it came one day while slipping in the mud. And I realize the Americans do not hate us. They are watching us, listening to us, offering us small things, a smile, a book, a second helping of coffee. And I don't know how to explain what that does to the soul. It feels like being forgiven, even when you're not sure for what." Helga, still holding her photograph, wrote, "Mother, the soap is real. The water is real. The people, I think they are real too. They ask no loyalty, only that we live and speak plainly. I am not proud of what we believed, but I am beginning to understand why it must be unlearned. Please don't hate me for that." That afternoon, the guards collected the letters gently. No threats, no edits, no red pen slashing away shame, only a stamp and a promise to send them. Some of the letters would never reach Germany. The mail routes were collapsing, cities were rubble. Addresses no longer existed, but that didn't matter. The act of writing, the hope behind it, was a kind of defiance, a defiance against bitterness, against silence, against the lie that kindness was weakness. At twilight, the sky turned the color of ash and gold. A group of women stood by the fences, watching the sunset. Johanna said quietly, "They may have won the war with bombs, but they are winning our hearts with soap and paper." And no one disagreed. The night had grown quiet, but not empty. For the first time in months, the silence inside the camp carried peace instead of dread. The sound of boots had softened. Even the clang of the mess hall bell felt less like an order and more like a rhythm of life. Yet within that calm, something deeper stirred, a quiet, painful reckoning. Helga awoke before dawn. The barracks still slept, rows of slow, even breathing beneath the dull glow of the moon. She rose, wrapped her thin blanket around her shoulders, and stepped outside. A faint fog hung low across the ground. Beyond the wire fence, she could see the outline of the water tower, its shape ghostly in the mist, like a cross standing over the camp. She walked toward the bathhouse. The doors were unlocked, as they often were for early shifts. Inside, the dim light from the ceiling bulbs made the steam shimmer. She turned the tap and let the water run, warm, clear, endless. For a long while, she only stared at it. That sound, the hiss of water on metal, was something she had begun to love. It spoke of something eternal, unbroken, beyond the reach of politics or hate. The Americans had given them many things: soap, food, warmth. But what struck her most was abundance without arrogance. They didn't flaunt it. They didn't weaponize it. It simply was. She cupped her hands under the stream and lifted the water to her face. The mirror that formed in her palms trembled, reflecting her image in ripples, her eyes hollow but alive, her hair thin but clean. For the first time, she saw herself not as a prisoner, not as a German, but as a woman. Simply, vulnerably human. And in that reflection, she saw something else. The faint ghost of her former self. The teacher who once told her students that suffering purified the soul. The woman who once clapped when soldiers marched past the schoolyard. The believer who thought victory was destiny. She whispered, "We were wrong." The water broke apart and ran down her wrists like forgiveness. When she returned to the barracks, the others were waking. Marta was already by the window, her hair tied back, humming softly. Johanna sat on her bed, writing another letter she would never send. Ingrid was mending socks with thread salvaged from old blankets. Marta turned, smiling faintly. "You went early again." Helga nodded. "I needed to see myself." Marta tilted her head. "Did you?" Helga hesitated. "Not the way I expected. I saw who I used to be. It frightened me." That day, the camp commander announced that a group of American volunteers would be visiting. Women from nearby towns, Red Cross auxiliaries, church committees. They would bring donated clothes and books. Some of the German women grew nervous, others curious. By noon, a convoy of trucks arrived. From them stepped a dozen American women, teachers, nurses, farmers' wives. Their dresses were plain but neatly pressed. Some carried baskets of bread, others folded shirts, bars of soap, and small cakes. The air tensed for a moment. Two worlds, once enemies, facing each other across a yard of dust. Then one of the American women, a tall lady with silver hair and a smile as gentle as a hymn, walked straight to the nearest prisoner and said, "You must be tired of gray. Try this." She held out a blue cotton dress, simple but beautifully sewn. The German woman blinked. "For me?" "Yes," the lady said softly. "It's already paid for." Those words, "already paid for," carried more weight than anyone could have guessed. They spoke of something beyond charity. They spoke of grace. Soon, others followed. Laughter, shy gestures, awkward words exchanged through translators. The visitors moved among the prisoners, offering gifts without pride, and the women received them without shame. Helga stood near the end of the line, silent, watching. She couldn't bring herself to take anything. But when a young American girl no older than 16 handed her a bar of soap wrapped in tissue paper, Helga froze. On the wrapper, in delicate handwriting, someone had written, "For someone's mother, sister, or daughter." That night, she placed the soap on her nightstand and stared at it as though it were a relic. Later, she returned once more to the bathhouse, where the pipe still hummed faintly in the dark. She unwrapped the gift, turned on the water, and watched the small white bar begin to melt beneath the stream. Tiny bubbles formed, transparent, delicate, rising and bursting into nothing. And she realized that kindness worked the same way. It didn't demand recognition. It didn't stay long enough to boast. It arrived, it cleansed, it disappeared, leaving only the faint scent of memory. Behind her, Marta entered quietly. She leaned against the wall, watching Helga. "They are not like us," Helga said quietly. "No," Marta answered. "But maybe that's what will save us." Helga turned off the tap. "How can a people so gentle win a war?" Marta smiled faintly. "Perhaps they didn't win with guns. Perhaps they won because they never stopped believing that soap and water matter more than flags." They stood together in silence, the sound of dripping water echoing through the room. Outside, night insects began to sing. A guard's flashlight swept across the path, then vanished. The world beyond the fence was wide and mysterious, but for the first time, it did not feel unreachable. Helga looked again into the sink's reflection, the trembling surface of the water, her blurred face beside Marta's. The two images merged in ripples. She whispered, It's strange. The mirror no longer frightens me. Marta nodded. Because now it shows truth. And in that truth, humble, fragile, gleaming like a soap bubble in dim light, they found something neither of them had expected to discover in captivity. They found the first glimmer of freedom. But freedom, as they would learn, does not always arrive with trumpet blasts or waving flags. Sometimes it arrives on a Sunday, in silence, in the hush between breaths, in the space where no one is watching. The women of Barracks C6 came to call it the quiet day, not because it was empty, but because it held weight. Every Sunday morning, the routine slowed. The guards relaxed their posture. The camp bells rang softer. The American flag still rose up the pole, but no orders barked across the yard. In that stillness, something holy settled into the dirt and wire. Church service was optional. Some of the women went. Some stayed behind and washed their clothes in the open tubs or combed their hair slowly by the windows, savoring the extra time. Some wrote letters, folded them, and placed them under their pillows, even if they doubted they would ever be delivered. But all of them, in one way or another, listened. To the birds, to the wind, to the sounds inside their own bodies that they had not heard for years. Helga began to walk alone on Sundays, tracing the edges of the inner fence where the trees grew tallest. She didn't speak. She just let her boots follow the shade. Once, on a particularly clear morning, she stopped by the chapel. She didn't go in. She only stood outside and listened. The hymns were in English, but she recognized the melody. Abide with me. Her mother had hummed it during the winters while making soup from turnips and memory. Inside, the pews were half filled with prisoners. American and German guards stood quietly in the back. The camp chaplain, a thin man with kind eyes and calloused hands, preached not of vengeance, not of righteousness, but of forgiveness. Sometimes, he said, the hardest part of mercy is believing we are allowed to accept it. Outside, Helga leaned against the stone wall and closed her eyes. The warmth of the sun pressed against her face like a hand. She whispered, I don't know if I deserve it. Later that day, back in the barracks, Marta sat cross-legged on her bunk, brushing Johanna's damp hair. The brush had been donated by a woman from a church in town. Simple wood, coarse bristles, but it had become a treasure. Johanna's eyes were closed. I dreamed last night I was back in Leipzig, she murmured. But everything was made of glass, fragile, beautiful, and I was walking through the city, trying not to break anything. Marta didn't answer. She only brushed. The strokes were steady, calming, the same rhythm a mother might use on her child. Across the room, Ingrid sat by the window, writing on the back of a Red Cross envelope. She had no paper left. The letter she wrote was not to anyone living. To Ilse, I carried your memory across an ocean. I wish you could see what I have seen here. Not glory, not justice, just decency. Quiet, steady, stubborn decency. It has cracked me open. It has undone me in the gentlest way. I remember your laughter before the war. I hope it would have fit in here. She folded it, slid it into the empty envelope, and placed it inside her footlocker. That evening, as the sun bled across the sky, the women were allowed outside for a longer walk than usual. The guards, some of whom had families of their own, stood at a distance, relaxed. One even played a harmonica under a tree, a slow, lazy tune that sounded like dust and cotton fields. The women strolled in pairs. No one ran. No one pushed against the rules. They had come to understand something deeper than obedience, the dignity of shared peace. Helga walked beside Marta, arms crossed loosely. There's something strange about Sundays, Marta said. What do you mean? They remind me that the world isn't ending. The time keeps moving forward, even without orders. Helga nodded, and we're still in it. They passed the garden plot, a small section of earth the women had been allowed to tend. Carrots, onions, herbs, nothing extravagant, but enough. Enough to coax life from dirt. Marta stopped and crouched down beside the sprouting rose. She touched the leaves with 2 fingers, delicately. Do you think something will grow from all this? Helga knelt beside her. I think it already has. A soft wind swept across the field, carrying the scent of turned soil, warm skin, and faintly, soap. They sat there until the light faded. No one called them back. When they finally rose, Helga reached down and broke a small sprig of rosemary from the edge of the garden. She held it to her nose, breathed deeply, and handed it to Marta. Smells like home, Marta said. No, Helga replied. Smells like something new pretending to be home. That night, the women didn't speak much. They slept easily. No one wept. No one dreamed of collapse. In the bunk above her, Johanna whispered, Do you think the war can reach us here? Helga, already half asleep, murmured, Not on Sundays. And for that night at least, it was true. But Sunday did not last forever. By early September, rumors began to stir through the camp. Quietly at first, like distant thunder. Repatriation. Orders were changing. Transport lists were being drawn up. Some women would be sent back before Christmas. Others, perhaps in spring. The Red Cross confirmed it a week later, their official with the soft voice and clipboard speaking carefully. Germany has surrendered. Your country is no longer at war. Soon, many of you will go home. Home, the word should have sounded like hope. But for many, it felt like a verdict. Marta was the first to break the silence. Home? She repeated flatly. To what? Ashes? Helga sat at the edge of her bunk, holding a bar of soap in her hands. The one with the handwriting, for someone's mother, sister, or daughter. She didn't look up. To who? She whispered. They had not forgotten. The cities, the bombs, the rumors, true or not, of Soviet revenge in the East. Letters from family had slowed to a trickle. Entire addresses no longer existed. Some had received one last postcard months ago. Others, nothing since capture. And now the Americans were telling them it was time to go back. Ingrid spent 3 hours that night staring at the small garden outside the barracks. She had tended it with quiet hands for weeks, pulling weeds, rearranging stones, pressing seeds into dry earth like prayers. The rosemary bush was growing. The carrots were ready to pull. What happens to the garden when we leave? She asked aloud. No one answered. The next morning, the camp chaplain visited the women's compound. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain shirt and a worn leather Bible tucked under one arm. He spoke gently through Kenji, the Japanese-American interpreter. You may be afraid, he said. That is natural. But remember, home is not only a place, it is what you carry with you. Marta whispered. I don't know if I want to carry anything anymore. Still, preparations began. The camp staff issued clean wool coats, cotton travel dresses, and simple luggage kits with blankets, toothpaste, socks, and 3 envelopes. All marked U.S. Army Repatriation Service. One guard handed Johanna her package with a polite smile. She took it slowly, her fingers trembling. That night, she sat with Helga by the footlockers. What if we come back to nothing? She asked. Helga replied, Then we begin again, but this time with what we've learned. The departure day for the first group arrived with no fanfare. At dawn, the trucks waited near the gate. The sky was overcast, a pale silver curtain that refused to lift. The air held a strange stillness, like the moment before a photograph is taken. 10 women stood by the loading area, carrying small canvas bags. A few had tears in their eyes, Others looked stiff, like they were preparing for execution, not release. One of the American nurses, a red-haired woman from Kansas who had brought them aspirin and stories for 6 months, approached quietly and placed a folded cloth bundle in Helga's hands. Inside was a fresh bar of soap, wrapped in a handkerchief with delicate stitching. On the edge, embroidered in pale thread, were the initials CSB. Helga met her eyes. "Clara?" she asked. The nurse nodded. "Clara Baker. My mother was German. We don't always get to choose who we hate, but we can choose what we hand to others." Helga blinked hard, but did not cry. She placed the handkerchief in her coat pocket. Near the trucks, a young American private, barely older than Marta's brother Hans, was helping women with their luggage. He offered each one a seat with the practiced courtesy of someone who had learned to treat former enemies as if they were merely travelers between storms. When it was Marta's turn, she hesitated. Then she turned back to look at the camp, the bathhouse, the chapel, the laundry line fluttering in the wind. She said quietly, "I didn't know I could miss a prison." The private didn't smile. He simply said, "It wasn't a prison, it was a pause." As the truck doors closed, Helga reached out her hand and touched the wooden wall, as if to anchor herself one last time. The wood was warm from the sun. Inside the truck, the women sat shoulder to shoulder, silent. Each carried more than they had arrived with, not in bags, but in memory. Steam rising through rafters, letters folded in tin cans, the faint smell of rosemary and lavender and clean towels. Marta closed her eyes and whispered, "Will they believe us?" Johanna answered, "I'm not sure, but that doesn't change what's true." And what was true was this. They had arrived as believers in a system of certainty, in purity, strength, punishment. But they were leaving as women who had been broken not by war, but by mercy. As the trucks rolled away, the camp grew small in the rear window. The chapel, the garden, the distant outline of the bathhouse fading into the morning fog. Ingrid reached into her coat pocket and removed a sprig of rosemary. She held it gently, close to her nose. "It still smells like Sunday," she said. No one replied. But in the hush that followed, even the wind seemed to bow its head. Not for soldiers or for nations, but for something rarer, for dignity restored. And yet, dignity, once broken and mended, never returns to its original shape. It becomes something softer, less proud, more aware of its fragility. Like paper dried after rain, it bears creases that never smooth, reminders of the storm. Years passed. The women returned to a country they no longer recognized. Bomb craters in the streets of Hamburg, burnt-out rail stations in Leipzig, half-crumbled apartments where familiar neighbors no longer lived. The war had ended, but the ruin had not. Some found family, some did not. Many, like Johanna, stood before piles of stone and wept without words, unsure whether to mourn the building or the life it once held. Others, like Ingrid, returned to find their hometowns swallowed by new borders, old loyalties declared dangerous, and former friends suspicious of any trace of America on the tongue. They didn't talk much about the camp at first. Who would believe it? Who would understand that while half the world burned, while cities starved and armies marched in defeat, a handful of German women had stood beneath warm water in Texas and been given soap, not punishment. Not indoctrination, just soap. But memory has its own rhythm. It returns in moments. Helga, now an old woman living in a small flat in Bremen, kept a wooden box beside her sewing table. Inside it, the stitched handkerchief from Clara Baker, still folded neatly around a bar of unused soap. She never opened it again after arriving home. But she never threw it away. Once her granddaughter asked, "What's in the box, Oma?" Helga only said, "Something that taught me to begin again." Ingrid planted rosemary in her garden each spring. She said it helped with the tomatoes. But once, when a neighbor commented on the scent, she replied, "It reminds me of forgiveness." Marta, whose brother Hans never came back from the Eastern Front, became a teacher. She refused to repeat the lessons she had once taught under the old regime. She taught music, poetry, hygiene. She kept a bar of U.S. Army-issue soap on her desk, not to use, but to explain. And every year, on the first warm Sunday of summer, she would say to her students, "There are things you will be told to hate. But kindness is not weakness. And soap," she'd say, lifting the bar gently, "can cleanse more than hands." The war, they understood, had not been only about weapons. It had been about ideas, about what it meant to be strong, to be worthy, to be clean. The Americans never asked them to renounce their nation. They asked for nothing at all. And that was what shattered the deepest part of them. The lack of vengeance, the lack of cruelty. Instead, they had been offered soft towels, slices of bread still warm from the oven, and envelopes for letters no one would read. That, more than propaganda or lectures, had collapsed the myth, not with violence, but with hot water. One winter, decades later, Helga received a letter, forwarded through a veterans association. It was from a woman in Kansas. The handwriting was faint but familiar. "I was the one who stitched the initials into your handkerchief. Clara's daughter. I found it in her things after she passed. She spoke of you once, said you were the first person she ever forgave without asking them to say sorry. I thought you should know. The soap factory where those bars were made closed years ago. But I still remember the scent. I still believe in it." Helga held the letter in her lap for a long time. Outside, snow fell lightly against the windows. She could hear the kettle beginning to whistle in the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of mint tea. She opened the wooden box. The soap inside had yellowed slightly with age. The lavender scent was faint now, like the ghost of a dream. But it was still there, still real. She held it to her nose, closed her eyes, and whispered the same words that had once echoed in a Texas bathhouse full of former enemies. How can they afford this? And now, at the end of a life shaped by war and soot and silence, she finally understood the answer. They could afford it, because they had chosen not to hate, because they believed that mercy was strength, because in the midst of the darkest century, someone in a uniform, with a country at his back and power in his hands, had placed a bar of soap in hers and walked away. No speeches, no conversions, just soap. And so it remained. Not a weapon, but a memory, a promise, a scent, a seed, planted in the most unexpected of places, and still growing.